Waitress buys dinner for a quiet soldier. The next day, helicopters land outside her restaurant, and she falls in love with the man who steps out. Rain tapped gently on the diner's windows, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat soothing the quiet town. Outside, the mist curled through the streets, softening the street lamps into glowing orbs of light. It was a slow Tuesday evening, just the way Jolie preferred it after a long double shift. The air inside smelled faintly of butter, brewed coffee, and the citrus cleaners she had wiped the counters with. She moved behind the counter with practiced calm, her dark ponytail brushing the back of her neck, apron tied loosely over her faded blue uniform shirt. A few regulars sat at their usual spots near the front, sipping coffee, reading folded newspapers. The jukebox hadn't played in hours. It was the kind of night where nothing stirred unless it had to. That was when she noticed him. The soldier. He had walked in quietly about 20 minutes earlier, sat himself down at the booth furthest from the door, the one in the corner where the shadows softened the light and people rarely looked twice. His uniform was slightly damp from the drizzle, the edges darkened from travel. He had taken off his cap and placed it beside him, but otherwise hadn't moved. He hadn't touched the menu, hadn't signaled for service. Just sat there, elbows on the table, hands folded like he was bracing himself against the weight of something no one else could see. Jolie had seen a lot of quiet men in this town, but this one... There was something different about the stillness in his eyes. She waited a few more minutes, watching him from the corner of her eye. Finally, she grabbed a notepad and pen and approached the booth. "You haven't ordered," she said gently, stopping just beside him. He glanced up at her. His eyes were tired, more than tired. They carried the haunted edge of someone who had spent too long pretending everything was fine. He shook his head once, then looked down at the table again. "I'm not here to eat," he muttered. "I'm sorry, I just needed somewhere to sit." Jolie tilted her head slightly. "You sure? Kitchen's still open." He hesitated, then finally said it, quietly, like admitting something shameful. "I don't have the money." That was all. Jolie didn't flinch. She didn't shift. She just looked at him for a second longer, then smiled. "Then tonight it's on me." Before he could argue, she turned and walked away. A few minutes later, she returned with a plate of hot meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and buttered green beans. A warm biscuit sat on the side, steaming. She placed it in front of him without ceremony, along with a glass of water. The soldier blinked. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally looked up at her fully, and there it was, the moment. His eyes met hers, and Jolie felt it hit her like a wave. Not love, not attraction, recognition. It was like she'd just handed food to a starving man, not just in his stomach, but in his soul. His eyes held something fragile and unbearably deep. Gratitude, yes, but also loneliness, the kind of loneliness that seeps into your bones and makes you wonder if you've disappeared from the world altogether. "Thank you," he said softly. "You're welcome," Jolie replied, her voice quiet but sure. "Take your time." She stepped away, but her mind stayed at that table. She kept watching him as she refilled coffee and cleared plates. He ate slowly, carefully, as if the food might vanish if he wasn't gentle with it. When he finished, he stood. He placed his cap back on his head and walked to the counter, stopping just short of the register. Jolie looked up from drying a mug, and their eyes met again. "I don't know your name," he said, "but I won't forget what you did." Jolie smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't need you to remember me," she said. "Just know you're not invisible." He nodded once, then turned and stepped back out into the rain. She watched the door slowly close behind him, the bell's soft chime fading into silence. Jolie stood there for a long while, her hands still, heart unusually full. She didn't know where he came from. She didn't know if he'd return, but for one night, in one corner of the world, someone had seen him. And that was enough. The next evening the rain had stopped, but the clouds still loomed low like a gray curtain draped across the sky. The air carried the scent of wet asphalt and firewood, the town exhaling slowly after a long, damp day. Inside the diner, the lights glowed warm, golden against the cool evening outside. Jolie was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled again. She looked up, not expecting anything in particular, until she saw him. The soldier. Same uniform, same quiet steps, same heavy air around him like a shadow that never quite left. He walked in without hesitation this time, heading straight for the same booth in the corner. He didn't scan the room like before. He didn't look unsure. He looked like someone returning to a place that somehow, in the smallest way, had started to feel safe. Jolie said nothing at first. She waited, let him sit, watched from the counter as he picked up the menu and studied it longer than he needed to. After a few minutes, he raised one hand slightly. Not a wave, just enough for her to notice. She walked over, pen and notepad in hand. "Something small tonight?" she asked. He nodded. "Grilled cheese. And a cup of coffee, if that's okay." "Of course it is," she said. No small talk, no questions. But when she returned with the food, she placed a plate with 2 oatmeal cookies on the side. "On the house," she said before he could protest. "Everyone needs something sweet after a long day." He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. And so it began. He came the next night, and the one after that, always alone, always quiet, always sitting in that booth like it had been waiting for him. They didn't speak much, but he always made eye contact now. He nodded when she greeted him. He stayed longer, lingered over his coffee, sometimes looking out the window with a gaze that seemed fixed on another place entirely. One night, Jolie decided to break the silence. "You from around here?" she asked as she refilled his cup. He shook his head. "North Carolina, originally." She smiled. "Not too far. Just enough to want a good cup of diner coffee, huh?" He let out a breath that might have been a chuckle. "Something like that." "I'm Jolie," she added. He hesitated, then replied, "Eli." That was it. A name, a thread. From then on, she began saving a piece of pie or an extra muffin for him at the end of her shift. Sometimes she'd leave a folded napkin with a smiley face beside his plate. It wasn't much, but it was something. One night, while she wiped tables and Eli nursed his usual coffee, she asked softly, "You just get back?" He nodded. "Rough tour?" He didn't answer right away, just stared into the black surface of his drink, then said quietly, "We lost 2 the last week." Jolie's hand stilled on the tabletop. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Eli's voice was low, almost distant. "I was supposed to be rotated out, but I volunteered to stay back, said I could handle it." He looked at her then, eyes clouded. "And maybe I did. But not all of me came home." Jolie sat down across from him, forgetting the rag in her hand, the half-clean table. She just looked at him. "This world," he continued, "it moves fast. Fast food, fast cars, fast answers, but I feel like I'm still walking in slow motion. Like everyone's miles ahead of me and I'm still back there, in that heat, listening to the silence after the last radio call." He shook his head, like trying to chase away the memory. Jolie said nothing. She didn't try to fill the silence. That was what made him say it. He looked at her, voice trembling with the weight of unspoken things. "The night you bought me dinner, it was the first time I felt like someone actually saw me. Not the uniform, not the job. Me." Her breath caught. She hadn't known. Hadn't realized that one plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes could reach so deep. But it had. And now, in the quiet of a half-lit diner booth, she saw the man behind the soldier, and he saw her too. The air that night was still, almost too quiet, as if the world itself had paused to breathe. The diner was nearly empty again, just one older couple at the front and a sleepy cook humming behind the pass-through window. Jolie moved slowly between tables, rag in hand, her steps more thoughtful than usual. Eli was at his usual booth. That corner of the diner had started to feel like part of him, like a space that held pieces of his silence and hers, woven quietly into the seat cushions and coffee rings on the table. They hadn't spoken much that evening. A few smiles, a nod. She had brought him apple pie without asking, and he had offered a soft "thank you" that carried more weight than any grand gesture. But as she passed his booth to refill a sugar jar, something tugged at her, a feeling like unfinished music waiting for its final note. She glanced at him, then paused. "Do you mind if I sit for a second?" she asked. Eli looked up, then shifted slightly to one side of the booth. "Sure." She slid into the seat across from him, folding her hands on the table. "I never told you," she said quietly, "why I bought you that dinner." He tilted his head, waiting. Jolie let out a breath. "Years ago, I was with someone, a Marine, Nathan. We met when I was 19. He was stationed nearby. We were young, stupid, in love." Eli's eyes softened. "He used to sit in that same seat, believe it or not," she added, half laughing. "Always ordered pancakes at night, said it reminded him of his mom." "What happened?" Eli asked gently. Jolie looked down at her hands. "Deployment. He wrote letters, called when he could, then one day a knock on my door. The uniform, the folded flag." Eli didn't speak, but the air around him shifted. He understood the language of grief. "I've spent years being scared of uniforms," she continued, voice lower now, "not because of who wears them, but because every time I see one, I remember what it feels like to love someone who can vanish without warning." She looked up at him. "So when I saw you sitting there that first night, I knew that kind of silence, and I didn't want you to carry it alone." Eli's throat tightened. He blinked slowly. "Thank you," he said, voice husky, "for not turning away." That was when it began. The next night after he left, Jolie found a napkin under his empty plate. On it, scribbled in clean, blocky handwriting, "Thank you for still seeing me." The night after that, another note, "You make the silence feel less like punishment." And then, once, "Some people talk, you listen. That's rarer than gold." She kept them all, folded them neatly, tucked them into her notebook at the end of each shift. She didn't know what they meant yet, only that they felt like breadcrumbs leading somewhere neither of them had been before. Then came the night everything changed. Eli had left earlier than usual, said he had to get up before dawn. Jolie had waved him off with a smile, the same one she always gave, hiding the way she already missed him before the bell above the door had even stopped ringing. As she cleared his table, she noticed something different, not a napkin, an envelope, plain, unmarked, tucked beneath the sugar shaker. She opened it with slow fingers, heart already thudding. Inside was a piece of lined paper, torn from a small notepad. The handwriting was the same, but this was more than a note. It was a letter. "Jolie, if I don't come in tomorrow, don't worry. I didn't vanish, not in the way people do. Sometimes I need space, or silence, or to feel like I'm not about to fall apart. But if I do disappear, really disappear, I want you to know something. Those dinners, that coffee, your quiet kindness, it gave me something I thought I'd lost for good. You made me feel like I was alive again, even if it was just for a few nights. Thank you, Healy." Jolie stared at the paper, her fingers trembling. She read it again, and then she cried. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks, salt mixing with the sweetness he'd left behind. Because she knew, in that moment, that something deeper had begun between them. Not because he said it, but because she had felt it too. Every night, in every word he hadn't said, and now she held those words in her hand, words that finally said, "You mattered." The sky that morning was unusually bright for a Thursday, streaked with the pale gold of early sun peeking through scattered clouds. Jolie stood behind the counter at the diner, humming softly under her breath as she prepped coffee for the breakfast crowd. The sizzle of bacon filled the air, mingling with the familiar chatter of locals filling their booths. Everything felt normal, predictable, safe. Until the sound came. A low, thunderous rumble shook the window panes, growing louder by the second. Coffee cups trembled on saucers, the lights flickered once. "What in the world?" someone whispered from a booth. Jolie looked up, frowning. That was not a storm. That was engines, heavy, military grade. Her heart jumped into her throat as she ran to the window. And there it was, not one but two military helicopters descended from the clouds, blades slicing through the air, kicking up a whirlwind of dust and debris, as they hovered above the street in front of the diner. The sound was deafening, pulsing through the small town like the heartbeat of something bigger, louder, more urgent than anything they'd ever seen. The entire diner emptied in seconds. People flooded outside, shielding their eyes from the wind, mouths open in confusion and awe. "Is there an emergency? Did something happen? Is this a drill?" Jolie pushed through the small crowd, apron still on, her feet crunching on gravel as she reached the edge of the sidewalk. Her eyes narrowed against the wind. Then the side doors of the lead helicopter swung open. A line of uniformed military personnel stepped out in perfect formation, each one crisply dressed, boots hitting the pavement with synchronized precision. They lined up quickly, faces unreadable, eyes forward. The town fell silent, and then he appeared. Eli. He stepped out of the helicopter, his frame tall and sure, dressed in full military dress uniform, pressed, polished, medals glinting beneath the morning sun. His cap sat neatly under his arm. He looked completely different, yet somehow exactly the same. His eyes searched the crowd, until they landed on her. Jolie's breath caught. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. He walked past the line of soldiers, past the rows of stunned onlookers, straight toward the front doors of the diner, toward her. His expression was serious, but there was something in his eyes. Something soft. He stepped in front of her, the noise around them fading into a hush, and then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a single white lily, and offered it to her. Not with drama, but with intention. "With all due respect," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the crowd to hear. "This is the first order I've ever given myself." He paused, locking eyes with her. "To come back and thank the woman who saved my life, with a plate of food and a moment of kindness." The world stopped. Jolie's lips parted, her eyes welled. Around them no one made a sound. She took the flower, her fingers brushing his. The petals trembled between them. And then, soft, shaken, but steady, she whispered, "Welcome back, Eli." He smiled, just a little, just enough. And for the first time in years, he looked like a man who had finally found a place to land. That night, after the helicopters had long since flown off, and the crowd had drifted away in murmurs of awe, Jolie stood inside the diner holding the white lily, its petals still cool from the morning air. The flower rested in a small mason jar on the counter now, beside the napkin Eli had left weeks earlier, the one that simply read, "Thank you for still seeing me." The door creaked open again around closing time. Eli stepped in, no longer in full dress uniform, but in a simple shirt and jacket. He looked different now, not just in appearance, but in presence, like something in him had settled. He walked up to the counter where Jolie stood alone, drying the last coffee mug of the day. "Got a minute?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, placing the mug down and pulling off her apron. "Always." He motioned for her to join him in a booth. She slid into the seat across from him, fingers still damp from the dish towel. "I didn't want the big show this morning to feel like pressure," he said. "I just needed you to know." "I know," she said quietly. Eli reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek white envelope, sliding it across the table. It was embossed with a gold insignia, the seal of the Department of Defense. Jolie stared at it for a moment, then looked up. "What's this?" "A formal invitation," he said, "to a medal ceremony. Mine, next week." She blinked. "You're getting," he nodded slowly, "a silver star for pulling 3 guys out during a firefight in Kandahar. I didn't want it, I didn't expect it, but they're giving it anyway." She touched the envelope with uncertain fingers. "That's incredible, Eli. You deserve it." "I don't know about that," he said with a slight smile. "But there's something else." He leaned forward, eyes steady on hers. "I want you there, but not as a guest, not as a formality, not as a +1 to dress up for a photo." She said nothing, frozen in place. "I want you there because in the darkest place I've been," he said slowly, "you gave me something bigger than survival. You gave me presence. You gave me warmth. You saw the part of me that wasn't in uniform." He paused. "I'm not asking you to wear a gown or smile for the cameras. I'm asking you to sit beside me, to be there when they call my name, because no matter what medal they hand me, The thing I'm proudest of is finding my way back to that booth in your diner." Jolie's throat tightened. "I'm not some grand story," he added. "I just want the girl who bought me dinner when I didn't ask." She swallowed. "You sure I won't be out of place?" Eli gave the faintest laugh. "You're the only place I've felt like I belonged." She nodded slowly, blinking back something sharp in her eyes. "Then I'll be there." A week later, under chandeliers and flags and the eyes of generals, Jolie sat in the second row of a military auditorium, a simple navy dress draped over her frame. Eli stood tall in front of a podium, the silver star pinned to his chest. He scanned the room during his speech, paused when his gaze met hers. And then he said, "You can call me a soldier, you can call me a survivor, but the truth is, I don't need to be remembered as a hero. I only need one person to remember that once I was just a man who sat in a booth and found a little piece of peace with her." The room went still. He smiled, and Jolie did not cry, but she held her breath. Because somehow, in that moment, every second of silence between them, every quiet meal, every scribbled note, every act of staying had led to this. Not a medal, not a headline, but a man who came home, and a woman who had waited without knowing she was waiting, until he arrived. The mess hall wasn't what Jolie expected. It wasn't sterile or intimidating like the military building she'd seen in movies. It was warm, loud, alive, walls lined with faded photos and patches from all over the world, voices overlapping, the clink of metal trays and silverware echoing like a drumbeat of camaraderie. Long tables stretched across the room, filled with men and women in various stages of uniform, some crisp and proud, others relaxed, sleeves rolled up, tattoos peeking from under cuffs. Jolie walked in beside Eli, her steps uncertain, fingers brushing the edge of her jacket. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, her hair loosely tied back. She felt unarmed, not because anyone was dangerous, but because she was stepping into a world that wasn't hers. Eli gave her hand a quick squeeze. "You okay?" She nodded, even though her stomach twisted. "Just new," he smiled. "They're loud, not mean, you'll see." They sat at a table near the center of the room. A few of Eli's unit mates nodded in greeting. One clapped him on the back, another gave Jolie a curious glance, but nothing more. Plates of food were passed down. Steak, mashed potatoes, cornbread, something spicy that made her eyes water just smelling it. She ate quietly at first, unsure of where to jump in. The conversation buzzed with inside jokes, jargon, and fast laughter. Jolie smiled politely, nodded at stories she didn't fully understand, laughed when it felt right. But inside she felt like a guest at someone else's family table, until someone asked her a question. "You're the one from the diner, huh?" She looked up. A man across from her, maybe late 30s, scar just above his right eyebrow, was watching her with curiosity, not judgment. "I guess so," she said softly. He tilted his head. "You ever serve?" Jolie shook her head. "No, I just serve food." A few of them chuckled, not mean but appreciative. "You did more than that," another chimed in. "He talks about you." Jolie's eyes flicked to Eli, whose ears turned slightly red. "He does?" she asked. The table quieted, just enough for Eli to mutter, "Not like that." But the soldier with the scar smiled, "Like you pulled him out of something." The energy changed, just a little, enough that Jolie found herself speaking. "I didn't do anything special," she said. "He came in and he looked like he hadn't been seen in a long time. I just didn't look away." There was a pause. Then one of the younger guys leaned forward. "That's rare," he said. "You have no idea how rare." Jolie looked around, and suddenly the room didn't feel foreign anymore. It felt heavy, with stories, with silence, with things too complicated to explain over dinner. She began to ask questions, not the kind that needed answers, just the kind that let people speak. And slowly, they did. A woman across from her talked about her daughter back home. Another shared a moment in Kabul he could never quite shake. Someone passed Jolie a slice of banana bread and said, "My mom used to bake this when I came home. Figured you'd like it." By the end of the meal, the noise had softened. The smiles were less guarded. And Jolie She didn't feel like a guest anymore. She felt like someone who'd been invited. Later, as the evening wound down and most of the table had cleared out, Eli walked her to the car under the warm orange light of the parking lot. "Thank you for coming," he said. She laughed lightly. "I was terrified, I know, but they're good. They're family," he said, "just one that doesn't always know how to show it." She paused, then asked, "Is it always like this? All the weight they carry?" He nodded. "Even when we smile, especially then." She looked at him, really looked, and in that moment he wasn't just a soldier. He was a man trying to build something solid out of everything he had once survived. Eli took her hand. "You don't need to be a hero," he said softly. "You don't need to fix me, or them, or anything." He stepped closer, brushing his thumb against her knuckles. "You don't need to be a savior." She didn't move. "You just need to be you," he whispered. "That's always been enough." The wind was cool, the parking lot quiet, and in the space between their joined hands, Jolie felt something bloom that had nothing to do with war or grief or survival. It was simply this: being seen, and finally being known. The building used to be a run-down print shop, chipped paint, dusty windows, forgotten flyers still taped to the door. But now, it smelled like garlic and rosemary and home. A warm, open sign glowed in the window, and above the door hung a simple wooden board painted in rich navy blue. The name was carved into it by hand: Table 17, named after the very table where Jolie and Eli first sat. The booth, where silence turned into something sacred. Inside, the space was small but full of life. The floors were reclaimed wood, uneven in places but polished to a honeyed sheen. Framed photos lined the walls, not of celebrities or critics, but of soldiers, veterans, families, smiling, serious, and sometimes tearful. Each photo had a little brass plaque beneath it with a name, a date, and a short quote. "Came home hungry, brought laughter back. First time I slept through the night." Jolie and Eli had poured everything into this place. It was more than a restaurant. It was a refuge. Each night the tables filled slowly. Veterans came alone, in pairs, with their families. Some wore old caps, some carried canes, some said nothing at all. But they came, and they stayed. Eli worked the kitchen mostly, sleeves rolled up, hands moving with quiet grace. He had learned how to make his grandmother's stew from memory, how to plate meatloaf with pride, how to turn cornbread into a reason for someone to come back. Jolie ran the floor. She poured coffee, told stories, laughed easily. She moved like someone who finally knew where she belonged. Each night ended the same. After the last plate was cleared, they would sit at table 17, soft jazz humming from an old speaker, the lights dimmed low. Jolie would sip her tea. Eli would write down a quote from one of the diners that night and tack it on the backboard. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't need to. And then, one Tuesday evening, just before closing, the door creaked open again. A young man stepped inside. He looked barely 20. His boots were scuffed, and his jacket hung loose on his frame. He kept his head down as he walked toward the back of the room and slid silently into an empty booth. Jolie noticed him right away. The way he didn't look at the menu, the way his hands trembled slightly as he laid them flat on the table. She looked toward the kitchen. Eli was already watching. She didn't need to say a word. He dried his hands on a towel, ladled soup into a deep ceramic bowl, and grabbed a small slice of bread on the side. Then he walked it out himself. He stopped at the young man's table and gently set the bowl in front of him. "Chicken and rice," he said calmly. "It's hot, not spicy." The young man blinked, startled. "I didn't order anything," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Eli offered a kind smile, one Jolie had come to recognize as the beginning of something good. "You don't have to," he said. He placed the spoon beside the bowl. "Tonight," he added, "it's on us." The young man looked up. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but in them was a flicker, small, timid, but real. "Thank you," he said. Eli nodded and returned to the kitchen. Jolie was already standing at the counter, drying a glass. She met his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. because in that moment everything they had built, every meal, every memory, every quiet act of love, came down to this: another soldier, another silent booth, another chance to say, "You're not invisible." And in that place called Table 17, that was always enough. It was a quiet night at Table 17. The last customers had gone home, the chairs were stacked, the lights dimmed to a soft amber glow that made the wood grain of the tables shimmer like old memories. Outside, the air was cool, tinged with the earthy scent of autumn leaves, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once before silence settled back over the town. Jolie stood at the counter, humming as she dried the last of the mugs. Behind her, candles flickered on every table, not the battery kind, but real flame, real wax, with little pools of warmth forming around their bases. She hadn't lit them. That had been Eli. She turned around and froze. Every table glowed. Every chair was empty, except one. Eli stood at the center of the room, dressed not in his apron or kitchen whites, but in a crisp navy blue suit she had never seen before. He looked up as she stepped out from behind the counter, her brow furrowed in surprise. "What is this?" she asked softly. He smiled. "A moment," he said. "One I've been waiting for." He walked toward her, slower than usual, his hands clasped in front of him. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, really looked at her, as if trying to memorize every line of her face, every glimmer in her eyes, every breath. Then, without a word, he reached into his jacket pocket and dropped to one knee. Jolie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. He held out a small velvet box, but it wasn't the ring that made her cry. It was what he said. "Jolie," he began, voice steady, low, filled with a tenderness that only years of quiet love could create. "I've worn uniforms, I've taken orders, I've stood in deserts and flown over mountains. But there's no battle I've fought that means more to me than this, loving you." She blinked, and the first tear rolled down. "You didn't rescue me with a medal or a mission," he continued. "You rescued me with soup, with silence, with staying." He opened the box. Inside was a simple gold ring, engraved on the inside with tiny, careful letters. Table 17. Eli's voice cracked as he said, "Will you marry me, not because we survived, but because we've learned how to live?" Jolie's hand trembled as she reached for him. She nodded, tears spilling freely now. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger and she pulled him up into her arms, holding him like it was the first and last time. They didn't kiss right away. They just held each other, wrapped in candlelight and years of healing. Outside, a deep hum rumbled in the distance. They stepped out into the street, hand in hand, as the town's eyes turned upward. A single military helicopter passed low across the sky, flying slow and steady, not in formation, not for war, but for joy. Its lights blinked through the dark like stars come down to earth. Neighbors clapped from porches. A few cheered. One little girl down the block threw flower petals into the air. But Jolie and Eli didn't notice the crowd. They were too busy watching each other. Later that night, someone quietly replaced the old sign above the door. A new one hung proudly by morning, carved by hand, brushed with gold leaf. It read, "You fed one soldier, you saved 100 more." And beneath it, in smaller script, "Love doesn't need a uniform, it just needs a place to land." Sometimes, love does not arrive in grand declarations or dramatic moments. Sometimes, it walks through the rain, sits in a quiet booth, and finds its home in a simple act of kindness. Jolie did not set out to change a life. She just offered a warm meal to a tired stranger. But that one moment lit a spark in the heart of a soldier who had forgotten what it meant to be seen. And from that spark, they built a table, a home, a love. This is not just a story about war and healing. It is a story about choosing to stay, about feeding one soul and discovering 100 more waiting to be heard. It is a reminder that even in the smallest town, at the quietest hour, love can still land like a miracle. If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep in your heart, We invite you to like, share, and comment. Tell us how it touched you. And most importantly, subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories, where each week we bring you real, emotional, life-affirming tales that remind us all what it means to love, to hope, and to simply be human. Thank you for watching. Stay kind, stay brave, and stay with us.